Ever since the Russian buildup along Ukraine's border last year, all the eyes have been on cyberspace around Ukraine and on the activities of Russian threat groups. When this year kicked off, I posted a top 3 threat video of 2022, and of course the number one was nation states. And in that segment, I talked about specifically Russia's buildup with Ukraine and the implications that that might have towards the overall threat landscape worldwide in cyberspace. I also mentioned how Russia would basically utilize cyber as a tool to, in general, disrupt or degrade both Ukraine's and NATO's command and control infrastructure as they make an armed push into Ukraine. Pair this prediction with WhisterGate and the number of other cyber attacks that took place within Ukraine prior to the invasion, and the way that that all basically preceded the invasion, you can kind of see how those predictions were justified. However, our worst fears appear to be happening right now, and Russia has just passed 2 weeks of this war in Ukraine. However, and this is kind of confusing to everybody that's kind of paying close attention to what's going on, it doesn't appear that they've employed their full suite of capabilities against Ukraine. And certainly included among that suite of capabilities is their cyber capability. We've actually seen a lot of cyber attacks lately, and you may have seen my last video talking about the Nvidia and the Samsung attacks with Lapsus, but those aren't related to this conflict, at least that we know of right now. I watched this one video and the guy basically opened up his video basically saying that there's a massive cyber war going on and that Lapsus was somehow involved, and that frankly is completely false. This is according to Lapsus. They are non-political and they are not involved at all in this conflict. These hacks are really just a ransomware group trying to get some coin. Though there is a very serious war going on, not all of the activities going on in cyberspace are tied to that. So I wanted to start by getting the record straight on that, because I'd seen some creators with some very large followings making those kinds of statements. It's incorrect, and I want to put that out there right now. And I want to also explore what we've seen in cyberspace leading up to the invasion and leading up to this moment right now, where we are right now and where we might be going in the future. So to start, why did we expect a massive cyber attack? To understand that, let's take a look at one of the core philosophies underlying the Russian military. And if you've been following this channel for a little bit and watching some of my previous Ukraine videos, you may already be familiar with what we're about to talk about, but we're talking about hybrid warfare. This is a concept that includes just about every function of both public and private sectors to basically create a holistic and cohesive approach towards warfare. And it's not just about conflict, it's about peacetime activities that can basically enable decision makers and negotiators with a better position wherever they are, give them more resources to do what they're doing. And it's not just a military concept. I've talked about in other videos that to this concept, war and peace is a spectrum and it's not a binary kind of thing. And so kind of approach it from that mentality. Critically within that, cyber and information are two major arms of this theory. For cyber, that means everything from gaining access to information systems for manipulation and use later in the future, or the exfiltration of critical data. It could mean denying services to your adversary. It could literally mean all kinds of different things that you can do in cyberspace, both in peacetime to get a better negotiating position, or at wartime to disrupt your adversary's defense. And then the information arm is similar in that there are different tools that you can use both in peace and wartime, but that can be everything from seeing bots on social media that are intended to disrupt and cause confusion and cause all kinds of infighting, to the use of propaganda and releasing false narratives through the news media to try to get a general populace to believe in something. I'm pretty sure that everybody watching this video right now, including you, can think of some examples where this has actually impacted you personally and where you have witnessed this, whether on social media or when watching the news. Frankly, this kind of thing isn't unique to just Russia, but they are certainly one of the largest implementers. I like to think of these operations as what's called shaping operations, and what that it really is you are shaping the operational environment to set up a more decisive action in the future. Those kinds of decisive actions can be everything up to and including an invasion of Ukraine. And that's generally what we saw. We saw website defacements, we saw WhisterGate, we saw HermeticWiper, we saw a lot of disinformation campaigns and false pretexts being pumped out immediately before the invasion started. Those all shaped the operational environment. At least Russia was hoping that those would shape the operational environment to better soften Ukraine as a target, so that way once they launched the invasion, they would have have a swift victory. Fast forward to where we are right now, 14 days into the conflict, and Russia still hasn't won. Ukraine is still standing strong and fighting hard. But does that mean that Russia has simply ceased running shaping operations? No, not really. There's a phrase, when in doubt, zoom out. And anybody familiar with game theory recognize that really a lot of this falls into action, reaction, counteraction, and counter-reaction. So let's say previously we've seen actions by Russian proxies and threat groups to target Western institutions online. The reaction appears to have been the defense of those systems, the expulsion of the attackers, and then generally the more open naming and shaming of Russia and Russian threat groups for allowing those cyber attacks to happen, as well as sanctions and other kinds of legal penalties inflicted on individuals in Russia. But that was then, this is now. Right now, the action is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the reaction has been the West's supplying of Ukraine with lethal and non-lethal aid. Everything from food and medical equipment to javelins and Stinger missiles, to even potentially a Polish donation, I guess you could say, pretty wild donation, of many MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. And that's not even including the rapid and massive economic expulsion of Russia. And that has sent the Russian economy and the currency, the ruble, into a free fall into levels that really are mainly comparable to North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran. Now, we're still fairly early in this process right now, so there's plenty of time for Russia to have a counteraction and to kind of see how Russia reacts to these Western actions. But thus far, it appears that Russia is kind of sticking to the script that they've implemented over years of practice and use in other kinds of environments, and that is to escalate. They've not only escalated in rhetoric, but they've escalated in violence as well, with the shelling and rocketing of civilian areas, and even the escalation in rhetoric by trying to create this false narrative that Ukraine that has nuclear ambitions, which is laughable. Now, lost in all of this is the cyber arm of the hybrid warfare model. We're seeing the information arm, and we're really seeing it, what, at least in our perspective, looks like Russia getting beat pretty badly in the information space. But I'd again caution to get, too excited, because, we are primarily the consumers of this kind of information. We're seeing lots of examples of information being utilized in this kind of an environment, and how, there are narratives that Ukraine is absolutely crushing it. There are narratives that Russia's crushing it. There are all kinds of these countering narratives. But if you consider the target audience of these narratives, Russia would primarily be targeting their domestic audience to remind them that their military is great and they're going to win. And for Ukraine in the West, you're going to see narratives that Ukraine's kicking butt and Russia's terribly inefficient. There appears to be certainly some validity to the fact that Russia is really struggling on the ground, but it's definitely not something to just take and run with and basically have this idea that Russia is about to collapse tomorrow. Though for all I know, maybe they will. There's compelling arguments either way. But again, we're not talking about cyber, and why is cyber being lost in this entire situation? Russia did employ cyber capabilities leading up to this invasion, but certainly nothing in the sort of comprehensive, devastating, and decisive action that we were expecting. Some of you might remember in the lead up to the war that I was pointing out with like website defacements and denial of service attacks that's not necessarily something to freak out about. They're pretty low impact, high visibility, but seeing some sort of malware or cyber attack that destroys things, then that's something to freak out about. Well, we actually got that too with WhisterGate and HermeticWiper. However, those didn't even have the kind of significant, massive, widespread impact that certainly we would have assumed if Russia was really taking the gloves off and firing everything. If anything, and this is more with HermeticWiper, it felt like it was kind of like a rushed execution and deployment of this malware, and not necessarily a thorough and long-term campaign, effectively and decisively setting the scene for the invasion. And that's led me to believe that Russia's pulling its punches in cyberspace consistent with how it looks like they're pulling their punches on the ground in the war. Though to be honest, I can't exactly tell you why that is. For those of you again that have been following what's going on the ground, and you're following a lot of the military analysts out there, you'll definitely see that it appears that Russia really at the outset of the war favored a quicker, lighter, quieter and less deadly approach to the conflict by very quickly trying to use air assets to basically bum rush Kiev and try to take the capital. Obviously that ended in complete disaster for them, and now they're put in this really challenging position on the ground where they're struggling to logistically support their forward troops. They've already suffered losses greater than probably what they originally anticipated, and every day that the fighting continues, they continue to lose not only more soldiers, but their economy continues to be drained in a pretty significant way. And that has led to them increasing violence by shelling civilian areas, basically intending to terrorize the people of Ukraine into folding. Now, from a cyber perspective, can we expect to see them utilize their cyber capabilities to achieve that goal? Maybe, but I would wager that Ukraine's not so much of a target anymore in cyberspace. And here's why. Anything that they would want to do in cyberspace against Ukraine, they can do much more effectively with military assets. Why deny service to a website in Ukraine when you could just literally bomb the server that's hosting that website? Why deny service to the internet whenever you can literally destroy the infrastructure that allows Ukrainians to connect to the internet? It appears that really the only direction that Russia can point their cyber capabilities at is the West, and more specifically at NATO. And that's where things get pretty complicated. We've already talked about in previous videos about how a cyber attack can trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, and that was confirmed by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Now that might have served as an effective but albeit temporary deterrent to Russia from, launching any kind of attack. Fingers crossed that that's not temporary and that deterrent stays in place really indefinitely. So from Russia's perspective, they can really only point their cyber capabilities westward, but they're also getting attacked themselves by a number of rogue actors like Anonymous. And this is where things get pretty fuzzy and pretty complicated. So where do we go from here? Well, it's kind of hard to say. Let's kind of assess the situation. Right now, Western countries are sending lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Russia has publicly released statements trying to dissuade Western countries from doing so by basically declaring that at some point they have drawn a line that if bases across the border in NATO are used by Ukrainian forces to attack Russian forces, then they are declared combatants. So there's been declared some pretty clear constraints on exactly how far this conflict can go between Ukraine, Russia, and NATO. It's also unclear if Russia is willing to continue to escalate to attempt to de-escalate the situation, as has been their historic MO. One thing that Russia might be trying to do in the short term is trying to ward off support from NATO to Ukraine. And one of the ways that they can do that is by trying to escalate to the point that NATO decides to de-escalate on their own, and then Ukraine is left on their own. And that kind of thing has worked for Russia in the past, so why not try it again? The problem there is that, we're already pretty high on the escalation ladder, and there's only so much further we can go till we're at the top. And nobody wants to go there, not even Russia. But among the ways that they can escalate is in cyberspace. So what kind of activities can we expect to see in cyberspace? I know that I mentioned that a cyber attack can trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, but this is kind of where things get a little fuzzy. Say you have rogue groups like Anonymous that are currently launching attacks on Russia. Russia also has a number of rogue actors in their own borders like Conti and Revil. Now, I know that they recently jailed Revil, but desperate times call for desperate measures, right? They could use those groups as a proxy to attack Western institutions. And I'm not saying that to insinuate that they are already proxies or that Anonymous is a Western proxy, because none of those appear to be true at all. Can you even call Anonymous like a group if it's not homogenous and not just like a connection or a collection of just randomly like anonymous people? Anyway, Anonymous has claimed a number of cyber attacks on the Russian government and inside Russia and Belarus. But on the Russian side, Anonymous is kind of an interesting and difficult thing to tackle, because again, they're not technically a proxy group. They are their own group doing their own thing. So one possible short-term course of action is that Russia uses their own internal groups like Conti and Revil and other groups inside Russia to basically emulate the same type of behavior and go after Western institutions. In this way, they're able to maintain some kind of deniability in the event that these attacks strike any kind of large organizations or government entities. Now, again, that's all pure speculation, so take that with the finest grain of salt. Short term, the cyber domain is certainly an interesting domain to keep an eye on. While we can all agree that it hasn't exactly played out as expected, there's certainly a lot of directions that this can go in the near term. But the same could be said about the general Russian war plan. I mean, it's almost like they forgot to logistics, but whatever. Long term, however, I think it will be very interesting to see how the threat groups within Russia behave. One of the primary differences between your typical government-backed threat group and say like North Korea is that a government-backed threat group tends to go more after information and access and not necessarily deploy ransomware. Ransomware is something that like a ransomware group does, right? They're not looking to make money. They're just looking for access and more abilities to implement effects on the target. North Korea, on the other hand, seems to behave a lot like a ransomware actor, and a main reason for that is because of their economic isolation, and that's just a way to kind of offset some of those incredible costs that those sanctions have on their government. As the economic impact hits Russia from all the sanctions and the isolation that they're now facing, it'll be interesting to see if their own threat groups start to emulate the same behavior, or instead of going after access to information and things like that, they're instead deploying ransomware more often and trying to get massive payouts to offset those costs. I guess you can say it's pretty convenient that they already have two very well-known threat groups in their borders, Conti and Revil, that have a lot of experience with ransomware. So that's where we've been, that's where we are, and that is potentially where we're going in the future. If this was helpful or insightful, hit that like button and be sure to share it with a friend so we can try to, keep people from freaking out. Again, with that video that I saw, it was really jarring to see somebody just be flat out wrong saying that kind of stuff about, what's going on and the NVIDIA hack. It's just, we got to put a stop to it. Check out this playlist for more information on what's going on, as well as all kinds of other things that might be helpful for you when identifying kind of the role that cyber and information play in hybrid warfare and how they play with this specific situation in Ukraine. And of course, we're going to be talking a lot more about this and other news stuff, so hit that subscribe button and stick around for more. With all that, until next time, bye.